Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be part 2 of the sword review for the Swords of Northshire custom katana that was sent to me for the purposes of review. A couple quick notes, caveats, disclaimers, if you will. Sword was sent to me for the purposes of review. They didn't tell me to break it, but I did. I'm got free reign to give you my thoughts and opinions and whatnot. I'm not being paid or compensated for the review other than the fact that somebody sent me a sword for free, and I'm not an expert, so keep all that in mind as you hear me speak. Take what I say with a grain of salt again. Not an expert, but I do practice some Japanese swordsmanship. Hopefully that comes out when you see the video, though maybe not as much as it should. I have a long way to go before I'm good at it, but I'm working on it. Anyway, last time in the previous video, if you haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description down below. I left off with using the sword, covering some of the dynamics, but I only swung it around. I talked about the aesthetics and some of the ordering processes and things like that, but I hadn't cut anything with it. So now I'm going to talk about the cutting side of things as well as the destructive testing, which has obviously happened up until this point. So first off, general cutting, it did pretty well. In the purposes of general cutting, I used this sword for iaido, general kata, as well as cutting some water bottles, pool noodles, tatami mats, things that you would hope this sword would go through without an issue. And frankly, I didn't really have much issue other than the knot on the kashra started to come undone. Unfortunately, that's not something I captured on camera, but through the course of normal use, the kashra knot started to come undone. The kashra didn't come unglued, it wasn't loose, but the knot on the ito started to come undone. And that was about the only functionality issue that I experienced. There were some other things that I really came to appreciate about the sword just in general kata in terms of drawing it and doing iaido. One was the habaki loosened up. It became easier to draw, though the sai was never really quiet or great, or it wasn't what I would necessarily call a great experience, but for a sub $500 custom ordered sharp sword, it was what I would say I would expect. Plenty of room to improve in that realm, but again, I have to temper expectations with price point. The sword was loud as I moved it around. It was a great training tool. It was kind of like the easy button to get the hasuji sound. That's not going to happen on every Swords of Northshire katana you get, but the bohi and size and the way the geometry worked out, it became a very fun tool to play with, kind of where the loudest point of your hasuji was. So as a training tool, it became kind of handy that way. Also, it's long and light. This again is part of the geometry that they were followed in the instructions I gave, but they gave me a light sword that is long, and it wasn't a bear to use this sword for lots of repetitions, and it was simultaneously, it didn't bother me to use it because it wasn't super heavy, but it was also long and didn't let me cheat. I had to move my hip to draw this sword correctly, and a lot of times taller folks using shorter swords, you can just draw the sword straight out of the scabbard. You don't have to kind of move your hip around, and you can develop some bad habits that are hard to unlearn, particularly if your martial art style suggests or demands that you move your hip as you draw the sword. So that was something, as a training tool, I really enjoyed using it. It was really that the ito started to loosen up and the kashra started to come undone that I would say is the only bit that bothered me. Cutting wise, it did everything it was supposed to do and held up. It didn't bend, it didn't twist, it didn't roll the edge, didn't lose any sharpness through the course of cutting water bottles, tatami mats, and pool noodles. Now, I should cover a couple caveats in terms of cutting. One, as I was cutting it, I usually tested it outside and it was very cold. So the targets, not all of them perform differently, though the tatami mats certainly do. They get a little more frozen than I would hope they would as I'm cutting them. And not only are these used Japanese tatami mats, which are a little harder to cut than perhaps some other types of tatami mats, but when they get close to frozen or are frozen or are partially frozen, they become even harder to cut. So keep that in mind as you see me cutting with this sword. I would say it cut pretty well through the tatami mats, especially given that it's not a competition cutter. It's not the best tatami cutter, but it certainly did a serviceable job. But just know I'm also performing different when it's cold. It's not just the sword. I'm not good when it's nice. It certainly degrades performance when I'm cold and I'm standing on snow and I just want to not be cutting stuff. The other bit to note is people were concerned that the bohi geometry that I got, in that there's one large bohi on this side, and then this side, only one side has this sohi, this secondary little bohi here. Would that impede cutting performance? So I did get steep angles and shallow angles, but I would personally say that is 100% due to my poor swordsmanship and technique, and not at all due to the sword. I didn't notice it canting, twisting, or pulling in one direction, or having more friction on one side, or consistently getting steep cuts when I cut one way versus the other way. I didn't find any of it to be a performance issue in terms of the bohi as I asked them to do. Now, this was an intentional thing. I asked them to do this, but I didn't find any any performance inhibiting factors as I was using it. All of it seemed to cut reasonably well. If my technique was good, I got a good clean cut, and if it was bad, I didn't. I would put most of that on me, or I'd put really all of it on me. So in terms of general cutting, the blade held up exactly as I would hope it would. A couple things to note. Obviously, the kashra started coming loose and came off and started unwinding. The ito started unwinding later. But through the course of destructive testing, one thing I want to show is that the kashras come off, the ito's starting to come undone, but everything is still actually pretty tight on the sword. It's obviously broken, but all of this actually held together pretty well, all things considered. Before moving on, there's a couple things I'd like to note about the handle and various component parts. One is the ska in general. So after breaking the sword and taking it apart and getting the handle or the grip down to basically the core and just the samegawa wrap, what I can see is that it really hasn't degraded in condition much past when I first got the sword and took it apart. There is what looks like a gap in one of the seams, or kind of where the two panels are stuck together, and I believe that was there when I kind of started this whole rodeo with the sword. I think it's just maybe improper construction, or not as tight a tolerance as you would really hope for, but I don't think it's a crack or broken in the strictest sense. Alongside where the kashra would be, obviously I wasn't particularly happy about the kashra coming off as quickly as it did, but I don't see that it is cracked or been damaged at all. Now also we can see that it's a full samegawa wrap. That probably added to some of the resilience I experienced in using it. It's a very thin, comfortable handle. It's not terribly shapely, but it's not overdone or axily as is often described in some larger handles. And part of that is likely the samegawa wrap. Now I can see the seam of the samegawa along the edge side of the tang or the nakaga. I didn't notice any gaps or issues while using it, and it seems to have held on and not come loose at all over the course of testing, which is something to note. It's a good quality. Very often I will see skas crack or degrade more substantially than this. So the fact that it held up as well as it did and was pretty tight overall all the way up into the end is a redeeming feature, certainly. The other thing to note is what I don't see on this handle, and that is the icky ooey gooey stuff that I often see along the ha and the mune, or along the edge and spine of the tang section. Basically, they put on some double-sided tape type stuff underneath a lot of ito or the wrap, the silk wrap. And what that amounts to is basically you start to feel it over time as the ito moves around. It can get gummy and make for, well, just a less pleasant user experience quite often. So I like to see that it's not on here, but that may be partially why the ito came as undone as quickly as it did. So again, not my favorite thing, but it is, I guess, worth noting that it's not all gummed up or disgusting. This, I suppose, could be rewrapped, and the fact that it's not all chewy and disgusting may help with that. I also see what appears to be like a hot glue substance underneath where the kashra was. I don't know if that's durable enough to really help the kashra stay on or not, but it appears to be a very spongy, hot glue-like substance. I'd also like to talk about the usage and the signs of handling that I see on the Fuchi kashra. And the thing to note about that, there are a couple factors that tie into that. One, I used this sword a little bit more than I did a typical review sample, but really not a lot. I had it for a couple months. I used it for at least an hour once a week, and maybe even a little less than that, at least 20 minutes a week. So not a ton of usage, but a fair amount, and a little bit more than I typically would. And again, I was the only one that got to handle this sword. I got it from the factory new, and I broke it. And so you basically, I feel like I can tell you about the entire lifespan of these fittings, how they came to me and how they are today, and know that it's my hands that did those actions. The other thing I should note about usage and preface before I talk anymore is really that it's very common for usage to show on Fuchi kashra. The patina, the paint, any type of enamel or lacquering or electroplating or engraving might show some signs of handling over time because your fingers are rubbing on it. It's a normal thing, but it usually happens over a longer period of time rather than a couple months for 20 minutes a week. It usually takes longer to wear away, and that's what I was surprised with. I'm starting to see the base metal underneath some of this patina that came on the Fuchi kashra, and I haven't really used it that much. So it's an important feature to note, and that's why I gave it so much kind of preface before really saying I'm not impressed with how quickly it's worn, is because if you're deciding to get these blackened Fujikasha from Swords of Northshire, just expect the base metals to show underneath a little more quickly than you might expect. At least if you plan on using the sword and handling it a lot, the base metals will show. I was a little surprised at how quickly they began to show here. So we'll talk about the destruction test now. So what did I do? Well, I did several different rounds of Tatami cutting, and none of that broke it. But when I moved on to destruction testing, first I started with beer cans. The thing to note about the beer cans is that it didn't destroy the edge at all. There wasn't any rolling or dulling that I was able to see, but there were some steep scratches along the surface of the blade. It was pretty significantly marred at that point, but again, that's pretty much what I consider. I'm just cutting through thin sheets of aluminum with water in between, but it was just scratching, surface scratching. That is all I noticed in terms of blemishes on the sword. Then I moved on to cutting some brush in my backyard. The brush, it didn't really degrade the sword, and one thing that I'm surprised about isn't not only that it didn't blemish the edge or roll the edge or dull the edge from what I was able to perceive, is that it didn't bend. There were some of these cuts that the sword absorbed a lot of shock. I cut into a wood target, especially as I was splitting some of the wood in the backyard. It absorbed a lot of shock and it didn't dull. The sword really didn't dull until I started doing some more stupid stuff with it. Now, in terms of stupid stuff, I cut some shaving cream bottles and they just explode and they're fun to do. I split some more wood. I split wood on top of a water heater. I just stabbed the water heater and then started hitting the water heater. And it's really the water heater that starts degrading the sword substantially. So as soon as I start hitting it against sheet metal, the tip deforms, but only the very tip. As I thrust into the water heater, it pierces the water heater and it does deform the tip, but it still preserves the overall shape. It's not as though the Kasaki straight up broke off, it just deformed slightly. And the edge certainly dulled, but it didn't have huge bits of edge deformation, no giant chunks missing or big bits of rolling. It just had dulled that razor edge to a less than razor edge. Probably not something that would cut Tatami terribly well after whacking the water heater flat against the sheet metal and doing that, but it still was, sharp enough to hurt. The other bit is I didn't notice that the sword bent at all until I intentionally tried to bend it by smacking the flat against a stand. That's when it really started to deform in terms of bending. Now, I hit it relatively hard with the intention of bending the sword, and that's about the only time that I saw this through hardened 1095 blade start to have any kind of edge deformation, or not edge deformation, but bending shape issues. And so I was actually pretty impressed by that. I expected it to bend slightly or twist slightly given what I was cutting in the wood side of things. That wouldn't be weird if it did, given that it's a thinner blade and whatnot. But it didn't. It actually held its shape really well, and it wasn't until I was doing a test that I was pretty sure was going to bend it that it started actually bending. So that was actually pretty good. The sword, the test that ended up breaking it is I braced this against a water heater and then beat it with another sword, simulating kind of sword-on-sword contact, but more than just sword-on-sword contact, kind of braced sword-on-sword contact, where the sword has to absorb a lot of shock. And there were some interesting things that happened there. One was that the edge started really deforming. It took almost a quarter-inch damage. So some of the pockets from the sword hitting are about a quarter-inch deep. Now, this edge geometry is relatively flat. I ordered kind of a razor geometry, so there's not a lot of kind of meat on the bone. It doesn't have that apple seed shape that's really bracing the edge. So it's not surprising that the damage is pretty deep in the sword. It's also rolling, not chipping over it. It's symptomatic of a through-hardened blade overall, and eventually the sword broke as I not only hit the sword with another broken sword in the attempt to simulate kind of edge-on-edge contact, but I'm flipping it around and hitting the back side of the blade, and that's kind of a tried-and-true recipe to break a sword, is I create some sort of cracks or something like that in the edge of the sword, and then I flip it around and beat the back of the sword, and it seems to accelerate the breaking side of things. Now, I've also got some images and video of the grain structure in the sword. You can tell me if it's good or bad. I'm not a metallurgist, I can't say for sure, but overall it seems pretty consistent and pretty small. I imagine it could probably be better than it is, but overall it seems to be reasonably consistent. Maybe some of the metallurgists, knifesmiths, swordsmiths that are watching this would be able to put some commentary down below and let me know if it's good or bad, but if you know what the grain structure is supposed to look like, hopefully this lets you see it. Anyway, that's what it took to break the sword, and overall I would say it performed as I would expect. So to define what I expect: water bottles, pool noodles, tatami mats, I expect the sword to stay sharp and straight and not twisted, and everything to hold together. And the only thing I would say that let me down there was this kashra. The ito wasn't as tight as it could have been right from the get-go, but the knot on the kashra started coming undone. And the kashra plane came off after a couple good hard whacks in the destruction test, and it's entirely possible that from a practitioner standpoint you will use this on some tatami mats that's less forgiving, and you'll get some good impacts on there, and it would come off. So I think that happened quicker than I would like. The thing that I have to compare that to is that it's a common problem across many Chinese-made, Japanese-style swords. If you're not spending a lot of money, if you're spending sub $500, I can't think of a company that doesn't have the same type of issue where, you know, with some severe use that the kashra would not come loose or come undone or come off. In fact, I think historically it's probably an issue because a lot of noto, a lot of built into the kata, as you put your sword away, you kind of do this motion to check and see if your kashra is still there. It's a part of the sword that might come off, and anyway, it came off a little quicker than I would hope it would. It's a common problem, but that doesn't excuse it. It's not good that the kashra came off as quick as it did. With that exception, everything else held up reasonably well. It was a good training tool. They met my expectations in terms of how long it should stay sharp, the targets it should stay sharp through. It didn't bend unless I was testing it against something that I thought would indeed bend it, and it didn't break until I gave it the tried and true recipe to in fact break it. But as I beat it against a water heater, split logs with it, whacked it in a brush, hit it against beer cans, or even just repeated beats with edge-on-edge contact with another sword, it didn't break. It didn't break until I started beating it in the same spot and then flipped it around and whacked it along the spine in a similar spot against a brace target like that water heater. Overall, though, it held up really well. I was overall impressed. So there's one other factor that bears noting before I move on to my final thoughts on this sword, and that is how Swords of Northshire actually constructs their sword. And it's important to know this not because it's really good or bad, but just because it might impact who you're actually doing business with. So first, Swords of Northshire, from my understanding anyway, is not an actual forge. They don't produce the sword specifically, as much as they work with a myriad of different manufacturers and forges to produce the product that you're looking for. And I suppose that offers them some flexibility. They know who is doing the best work at the best price, and there is value to that. I'll talk about that more in my later statement on whether or not I think it's worth it, but suffice to say, I was really impressed that I got what I ordered and that my order came through, which is not something that is easy to do. I've ordered custom swords in the past, and very often things do not go exactly to plan. In this case, I would say safely that it's the best case scenario that I've had ordering from a Chinese manufacturer with a bunch of custom options and getting as close as possible to exactly what I had ordered. So again, I will talk about that in greater detail in a moment, but the point is that it does add some value the way they do business. I'm not saying that they have to be a forge or produce their own product to be of value to a customer. The point is that in dealing with a myriad of different manufacturers that produce your product and then putting your name on it, you may inadvertently do business with somebody that you don't want to, or your customer might. And that's particularly important when I talk about the company Ryan Sword. Now, some customers, some sword buyers that are in the community know a little bit about Ryan Sword and may have very positive feelings or very negative feelings towards that company. It tends to stir up some emotion to some of the folks in the community. And so I'm not trying to stir up drama as much as I'm trying to say that if you are vehemently against doing business with this company, then you may want to alert Swords of Northshire that you don't want your sword to come from them. Again, they work with a myriad of manufacturers, so it's entirely possible that they could have your sword built by somebody else. But if you are vehement about not doing business with Ryan Sword, then it is a factor you should know that Swords of Northshire does periodically do business with them. Now, why is that? Without getting into a bunch of details that you can really probably find better info on yourself, Ryan Swords was accused of selling laminated blades, which is a particular type of forge welding and combining of different materials to make a sword. They were selling laminated blades, which are more laborious and therefore more expensive, that were not in fact laminated blades. The trick is, for customers, you oftentimes have to break the sword apart to discover if it's laminated or not. Some folks actually went ahead, bought a laminated sword, paid the money for it, broke it in half, found out that it was not a laminated sword, and subsequently Ryan Sword lost a degree of trust in the community. To combat that, Swords of Northshire has mentioned to me that they do not order laminated blades from Ryan Sword. It should also be noted that there are plenty of happy customers that have purchased Ryan Swords, and that most people's disagreements with Ryan Sword don't tend to be about performance or functionality as much about honesty or just a general level of trust. So the point is that because Swords of Northshire does business with Ryan Sword, if there is a product from their assortment that you like, it's important that you know who your money is going to support. At least in my mind, it's important to note that thing. So if you are opposed or for, it's something you now know. Now is the part of the review where I can answer the question, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? And this is where the answer takes a little bit of a fork in the road, given that you can think about this sword logically from two different angles. One is as a $290 sword at its core. That's what this sword is. If you strip away all the embellishments and extras that I added, this sword would cost you $290. Obviously, there's some aesthetic changes, but they don't really impact performance overall. And so if you look at how the sword performed, if let's consider that at $290, and that's where I'd say, I'm kind of on the fence. It's not a bad sword. In fact, it's a very good sword. It's just that it's not the cheapest sword, so it really comes down to, do you like one of the offerings that Swords of Northshire had? The sword held up remarkably well. It was sharp when it came out of the box. It cut reasonably well. It didn't bend very easily. Overall, the product was great. But there's a myriad of great products out there, and this one doesn't stand apart a lot from other $290 swords in terms of performance. And so from that standpoint, I can't necessarily say it's a absolutely go buy 20 of them right now, but it's certainly not a ripoff. If you find something you fancy at Swords of Northshire, I'd say they made a very good product that seemed very durable and was also light and fun to use. So from that standpoint, I think it's overall a good product, certainly not a ripoff, but not something that necessarily wowed me either. The flip side is, let's think about it from the standpoint of a $475 sword. Is it worth it for that? Well, here we have to consider all of the other aesthetic embellishments that I added. Not only that, but all of the random crap that came out of my head that is not necessarily standard at all. I had embellishments on the saya, I had engraving on the blade and on the habaki, I had a special type of bogie done on one side, I had different types of hamon put on each side of the blade. I picked custom fittings and I gave very specific dimensions in terms of how long the blade should be and where the bogie should start and how it should terminate. A lot of very specific measurements and details, and realistically I thought they got most of them, and I had a chance to really get all of them if I wanted. The point is that overall they really gave me what I wanted. Service was good, communication was good, and if you value your time and want a custom sword but don't have the money to pay for the quality or the high-endness, the thousands of dollars it really takes to do it on a purely custom level, well, this is a great option. There's not a ton of options that are out there that really hit the nail on the head as well. I've had other custom swords made, and granted I have to take it with a grain of salt because very often I'm getting a review sample, and as a reviewer you have to examine, well, they know it's going to be used for a review. Also, I can't really expect a lot because I'm getting a sword for free. I don't want to bitch and moan about things I'm getting or not getting, given that I'm not paying for it. So there are some things to consider there. However, in all of the experiences I've had, Swords of Northshire seemed to get what I was asking right out of the gate the most, gave me the clearest idea of what I would be getting based on my order, and I really value that. It's a pain in the butt to go back and forth when you have an idea, and to see it executed the first time right out of the gate is really refreshing. It's not something that I always have had that experience with. They're not the cheapest, but at the same time, if you value your time and don't have a lot of time to go back and forth with ordering, you need it to be done right the first time, and you need it to be value-based as well because you don't have thousands of dollars. I think $475 is a very compelling option given especially the difference in price. It's $300 to $475. It's another $175 to get all of the additional embellishments. And to you that might seem like an enormous amount of money. It's certainly nothing to laugh at, but it's also a lot of additional work. So all things considered, I think that is where Swords of Northshire really stands out, is that they offer a myriad of different options and they're able to execute on them the first go round, and the service level that I experienced was also very good. So if I take in contrast that the product didn't necessarily wow me with its performance, but it held up in what I would expect a very good or great sword to do, well then I'd say that those embellishments are what throw it over the top. The value of being able to choose a sword and get all of the things exactly the way you want at a cost-effective price. Obviously, it's not at the same level as many of the more custom-made blades out there are. It's at a mass production level of quality. But overall, I think that that's where the value really stands out. And that's where I would say, yes, I think that the Swords of Northshire offers a very compelling offering, something that I would recommend a lot more highly if that's an important factor to you. If you don't care about those bedazzlements, I'm a little more on the fence. If you do, I thought they did a great job with hitting exactly what I was looking for the first time around. And obviously, I place a great deal of value in it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but that is what I think. Anyway, overall, my experience was really quite good. For sub $500, the sword held up well, and I was really impressed with kind of the training tool I got out of it. It was a fun sword to move around while I had it. Unfortunately, now it's no longer in a state of goodness, but anyway, it was a fun one while I had it. I hope the video has been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free and throw them in the commentary below. I'll link the previous video as well as dimensions about this sword and a link to Swords of Northshire in the description down below. And as always, cheers and thanks for watching.